Welcome, folks, to another episode of the SEO series. Today, one has been hotly awaited and definitely a hot debate right now, and that's ChatGPT versus Google and essentially what it means for marketers. We're privileged to be joined by one of the best to do it, and that's Kevin Indig. You got to hear from him already, but given a bit of his background, he's both a practitioner and an advisor who's worked with amazing brands like Shopify, G2, Atlassian, Hims, Reddit, and a lot more. So a lot of companies you're familiar with. He's helped companies acquire 100 million plus users through SEO over the last decade. An international speaker, as we've well heard, whose sharp perspectives are also to be found in the growth memo. And with that, Kevin, welcome. Anything I missed out from that wonderful introduction?
No, that was amazing. And I just want to say it's always great to be on with you or, of course, with Josh. It's always a pleasure. It's always a good time. And always, I don't know, get to some new insights through the questions. So I was looking forward to this a lot.
Amazing. To give other folks a view into the agenda that will hopefully bring you through today, it's around T's runaway adoption, its impact around search behavior, what that means for marketers, and then we'll try and leave you with some of the action items that are actually working for teams today, and we'll leave plenty time for Q&A. So with that, before we get into the core content, just like Josh does, I'll give you a quick hint at our early access that's available for this week. Definitely, as we've dived deeper ourselves into SEO, there's always the prioritization problem. Like, you can spin your wheels producing content, but only 10% of it will actually drive results. And I think, as we'll look here, AI search is making that challenge even harder. So our new prioritization layer helps you combine your intent data, first-party metrics, and off-site signals. And you'll notice 19 isn't a mistake. It's someone grabbed one on me earlier. So unfortunately, for everyone else that's here, there's one less spot, but we'll be delighted to offer these slots up to people who've taken good time out of your day to hear from ourselves and Kevin. And you'll get a dashboard that shows you exactly where to focus resources for maximum impact. So where to go and create content, how to best refresh, and then what are the offsite signals to go and care about. QR code and email are there for your reference. I think Ali's going to drop it in the chat later, but we'll come back to that later. But 19, I'm sorry, instead of 20 available today. With that, the runaway train. So, Kevin, we were piecing through some of the metrics earlier, like adoption stats, plus 94% year over year in the US, 131 over towards Europe in the UK. Google's like flat to declining in the same time frame. Maybe put into context your read on this data. Like, how do you contextualize it? Is it sustainable, or are there limits maybe to where ChatGPT can actually reach Google's scale?
Totally. Look, like growth of ChatGPT is eventually going to slow down. But so far, there's no sign of slowing down. And I think the opposite is more the fact. It's almost like more accelerating. And so I did this prognosis, this projection of like when would they meet Google? And I'm currently at probably 2028. Could be a little later. And to be fair, like visits and traffic only says so much. What's interesting is that behind the scenes, ChatGPT has grown its monthly active users by 4x over the last 12 months. Do that at that scale, first of all. And second of all, that brings them to 700 million monthly active users. So they're growing faster, or maybe at the same pace as the top social networks. And so you can already tell this is a massive platform for attention. And we're going to talk about some more traffic stats in just a moment. But just the fact that this is growing faster than anything we've seen before already tells us that this is a platform that we want to be present on in some way, shape, or form. We can discuss how, but it's clear that this is critical and it is different from what's out there so far.
I love it. And you mentioned platforms. I pull this from a great debate or conversation you had with Tim Solo, but like when we talk about platforms, like Google has been the platform really when we think about like organic search over the last decade plus. And maybe give us the background as to like what Tim shared out, what you came back with, and then maybe the momentum you've seen so far on ChatGPT.
Totally. So shout out to Tim, extremely sharp cookie. We've been business friends for many years. And so what Tim is saying here is essentially that the growth rate of ChatGPT is slowing down, at least according to Ahrefs data, right? I have to say that. And my comeback was that the traffic share from ChatGPT keeps growing. And so The coming back to Tim, growth rate means month over month growth. And we have all, and I've seen this in my clients' data as well, we have all seen less referral traffic in July and August from ChatGPT for various reasons. One is that they send more traffic to Reddit and Wikipedia and some of the bigger platforms. Another one is that now with ChatGPT 5, you have the handler or the router who decides which model to use. And usually there's only outgoing traffic with reasoning models for the or it's more likely, I should probably say. However, what's interesting is that when you look at the share of traffic that websites are getting, the share is dropping from Google and it is still growing from ChatGPT. And it's absolutely important to call out here that these numbers are still very small, right? ChatGPT, I just had a client, actually had two client conversations today, and they both found that ChatGPT sends them around 7 to 10% of conversions that they would have gotten from search. You will also find companies that are saying that they get maybe 10% of total conversions, but it's usually smaller companies and it's edge cases. Numbers are small. This is an emerging platform, not the platform that, is the biggest source of traffic and conversions today. But when I look at this line that I shared on the right-hand side and it keeps growing, it's going to get there. And so it reemphasizes what I said earlier. It's early, it's messy, and so was Google 20 years ago.
Yeah, totally. You mentioned it's early. Obviously, there's shifts, there's trends emerging, like what you've outlined here, broader use cases, a redefined journey, and then exactly like what you said there, higher conversions. Maybe put into context, like why marketing teams need to care about this. You mentioned like it is lower traffic, but what might it mean for like existing processes that teams are currently running?
Totally. So there's, excuse me, there's 2 to 3 really interesting things here to say. One, ChatGPT is different as in so far, and by the way, ChatGPT and OpenAI researchers just published a paper a couple of days ago about the biggest use cases on ChatGPT. And what stands out is that the majority of use cases are, it's not search, right? This is not a search engine, but people are doing things. They're using ChatGPT as a coach, as a sounding board, to write, to edit, to generate sometimes spreadsheets and all that kind of stuff, right? So it has many different use cases, which is very different from Google. And at the same time, search can occur within any of these use cases, right? So if you use ChatGPT as a sounding board, say you had a hard day, maybe it recommends you a book at some point in time. And this doesn't come randomly, right? But I just want to say one of the interesting things is that this idea of user intent becomes more fluid in conversations or basically in conversational LLMs. The second thing is that when ChatGPT sends traffic out, it is usually transactional in nature, usually, and it converts at a much higher rate than Google, right? So this referral traffic is much more qualified than on Google. And of course, the hope is that ChatGPT will send more referral traffic out over time so that this becomes a kind of a significant and stable source of customers. And that also means that the way that we're discovering products and brands and services and the way that we're making decisions is also shifting. Quick segue, I'll keep this short, but I just came back from a G2 event in London. And for that event, I put together some data. And one of the slides that I showed was that when it comes to how people put together a short list of software solutions, right? So if you're looking for, I don't know, a content management system or something like that, the majority of times people already use AI to put these shortlists together, right? So we're in an environment with much less friction in Google search that has many different intents and behaviors, but some of them are transactional and search-like in nature. And when that happens, the quality is much, much higher.
Oh, so interesting. It reminds me of like when you mentioned different use cases and then GPT or AI search becoming key to like how people make decisions. It reminds me of recently we had George Bonacci on from Ramp, and we were discussing that both of our sets of parents now use ChatGPT a lot more to like search for stuff than my parents are technophobes. They could not use Google no matter how many times I show them. But ChatGPT is conversational in nature. And I think that the data you show here, Kevin, like starts to confirm longer search intent, maybe more detail. And what you mentioned there too about G2, like people are using it for deep research. Like it's probably compressing the standard content funnel, but just speaking to the data, maybe bring us through what you found here around prompt length.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Owen. It's a perfect segue because there's so many times that I have already used ChatGPT's camera function to solve a problem outside of the digital world. And I think that's just one good example of how useful and frictionless this is. By the way, I've never used Google Lens, or maybe once or twice, to take pictures of plants. But anyway, when it comes to online interaction, right, we have much, much richer searches, right? As you can see here, the length of prompts is something like 25 to 30 times what it is on Google search. And so this is my biggest point when people tell me, hey, Kevin, AEO or GEO is really just SEO. And I'm like, yes and no. My biggest argument is that people are using these incredibly rich prompts to not just say and indicate what they want, but also who they are, their situation, the context in which they need this, right? So this is incredibly rich context. And on the other side of this content marketplace, right? Think about ChatGPT or Google search as a marketplace of searches and content or available information. And on the other side, on ChatGPT and on Google, we have content that for the last decades has been generated and optimized for shorthand queries, right? So the takeaway here is that people are searching with much, much richer context. Oftentimes, there's a big gap on content that can fulfill or address this context. And as a result, people get to their final destination much, much faster, right? If you have to use short keywords that are 3 to 4 to 5 words long, you might need 10 sessions or 20 sessions across several days to get to where you want to go. But if you have these quick, rich conversations, you might get to your answer much faster, sometimes within an hour or less. And that compresses the user journey, right? And so that, once again, is why it's so critical to create and optimize content for these hyper-specific prompts and questions so that when the user journey, quote unquote, happens, or the buyer journey happens, you're there. You're not still in the old Google world where people optimize word queries.
There you go.
Yes. Did I cut out there
Yeah,
at the end? Okay.
just a little bit, yeah. But I think what you were saying, Kevin, was
Oh,
super
man.
interesting. And like, if we go on to the next slide, so earlier you mentioned referral traffic going towards like Wikipedia and Reddit. I think what you were getting at on the last slide as well was content needs to be like fit for this new purpose, and it's going to compress the buyer journey. Like where we're all used to SEO, there's 10 blue links, there's multiple pages. It's very clear of intent, options, page. Within ChatGPT, there's a bit more of an abstraction where now the agent is involved. But I looked at this data that you shared in the growth memo and I saw, wow, like over 3,000% increase in referrals. I'm like, unfortunately, I don't see that big a number on my side when it comes to traffic. But I think maybe put into context what was underlying this and maybe what people can take away from it.
Yeah, totally. The first time that I showed this chart to a client, they were like, should we expect the same growth of referral traffic on our side as well, right? Should we expect to get 3,500% more referral traffic from ChatGPT? And the answer is ideally, but the reality is no. And the reason is that even though referral traffic from ChatGPT to other sites has gone through the roof, it goes to more consolidated destinations. So it goes a lot more to Reddit, it goes a lot more to Wikipedia, LinkedIn, YouTube, the big platforms. And so, unfortunately, at least as of right now, we're seeing a bit of a consolidation of outgoing traffic, even though it's going up. And so, of course, the hope is that down the line, this becomes more democratized again, and like more sites are seeing referral traffic from ChatGPT. And I will also say it's important to acknowledge that sending traffic out is not the goal of ChatGPT or other LLMs, right? Their goal is to give you the best answer. And in some cases, that takes an outgoing click, like when you want to buy something and you cannot, of course, cannot check out on ChatGPT. So you go to Amazon, eBay, Walmart, all these destinations. And in other cases, it's the validation click. So you get an answer, and it's really important for the answer to be accurate. Think about health, for example. In that case, ChatGPT is much more likely and willing to show you sources so you can check for yourself, right? And so I just want to say, even though outgoing traffic is going up, it's not in the nature to send traffic away. And it's much more interesting in which context your brand is mentioned, right? So there's this kind of tension between citations and mentions on ChatGPT. And I usually manage expectations of my clients when it comes to traffic, but I don't manage expectations when it comes to being mentioned in a certain context in an answer on ChatGPT, because that's where you influence buyer decisions.
Interesting. Do you want to speak more to that, Kevin? I know we had a lot of questions in the lead up to the event of people asking almost for the difference between a mention or a citation or why they might care. It might be akin to what people are used to in like digital PR or offsite actions, but maybe just give us a bit more feel for when you say mentions and citations, like how that culminates on an actual search.
Yeah, totally. So the biggest difference is that a mention is basically an inline appearance of your brand in an answer, right? So when you ask what are the best content management softwares or platforms, better said, ChatGPT might say, here are the five most or best rated ones, right? It's Webflow, blah, 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 blah. A citation, on the other hand, usually appears around the answer, sometimes as like an actual citation, sometimes in a side rail, sometimes at the bottom, depending on what you're prompting on ChatGPT. And so a mention obviously does not lead to a click. What mentions lead to is oftentimes that people go to the homepage of a vendor or an e-commerce company or a store or something, and then go and buy and sign up. And citations often lead to referral traffic. So only when you're cited is there a chance of getting referral traffic. But again, I think there's like a bit of a false focus on citations versus mentions, whereas mentions are much more likely to appear and are much more likely to influence buyers as they evaluate their options and maybe learn more information.
I love it. Great segue into this. So you mentioned influencing buyers. Again, one thing you called out here was higher conversion rates. When we look at GPT versus Google, maybe tell us a bit more here again about what you found.
Yeah, it's really interesting because so first of all, this is actually like a somewhat controversial topic because there's data saying that LLM traffic does not convert at a higher rate. However, this is similar web data across 7 billion queries and across many million users from which it gets clickstream data. And so this data is incredibly robust. And it does show that at least in the US, the conversion rate of referral traffic is much higher. Now, keep in mind that referral traffic from ChatGPT is much lower in absolute terms. But again, when it arrives, it has a higher conversion rate. So people are much more likely to buy when they arrive to your site from ChatGPT. In the UK, ChatGPT is actually catching up. And so there is a graph that is a chart that shows the conversion over the last 12 months. And what's interesting about this is that in the US, the conversion rate is already higher than from Google, but it's also growing at a faster pace. So that's interesting. And in the UK, we're seeing the same thing. So in the UK, referral traffic from ChatGPT or better learning referral traffic has just surpassed, conversion rates have just surpassed Google in the UK. You don't see this in the bar chart version here on the column chart, but in the line chart version, that it's growing at a faster pace. And so what's interesting here is it's not just more users on ChatGPT driving that growth of conversion rates, it's also better models. So the better the model is, meaning ChatGPT 5, the underlying LLM model, the better the answers that you get and the more qualified you are over time. And so the big theory here is that if ChatGPT keeps growing in adoption and usage and better models lead to higher conversions, then this could be an incredibly rich source of converting users, whether they come directly to your site or whether they're influenced through a mention, for example.
I love it. We had many questions come up in the Q&A, one from John included, that said it's a very controversial topic, but what was it, the sample size again? Kevin, you say 7 billion data points?
Yeah, yeah, 7 billion data points.
Big.
So
Okay.
there's a really good study. I just had this conversation on LinkedIn. That's why it's on top of mind. There's a really good study from AMSIF Digital that looks at 54 sites and their referral traffic and how it converts. And they found that the conversion rate from LLMs, specifically ChatGPT, is not statistically significantly higher than from Google. But when we look at the mean on the average, it is much, much higher. And so that's why I pointed out the sample size for similar web data, because it is obviously much, much larger. And so I think you can detect that effect at a bigger scale when you look at
Mm.
this large data sample size.
I love it. Like we mentioned quality versus like quantity there. On the marketing side, we're always looking for incremental gains or massive gains that could be got when it comes to driving traffic in front of our users, driving pipeline. To my eyes, this looks like an amazing set of early and like growing signals. Maybe put into context what you have here, Kevin, in terms of advice for teams who are maybe looking to like balance or rebalance their resources as well.
Totally. So I hope it's pretty clear that like Google is still used by everyone, and you would be foolish to abandon Google. I will like quick segue. There's a lot of segues I'm opening up here, but anyway, I think it's relevant. I think for like very new startups or market entrants, there actually is a very interesting question of whether you want to focus a bit more on ChatGPT than Google, because the competition is so much slower. Anyway, back to the main track. Google is still incredibly relevant. And again, you'd be foolish to abandon Google. But the good news is that most of the things you do for Google, for classic search optimization, also have an impact on ChatGPT. So it's the same tactics, but it's a different playing field, right? And so sometimes they don't go far enough about hyper-specific content. And so critical for you to run on all of these tracks, run on Google, on Bing, ChatGPT, maybe Gemini. And across these platforms, you want to track the right signals. Mentions, meaning how you appear, how often, in what context, and with what sentiment. And you might still want to track ranks on Google, right? And maybe impressions. Citations, again, not clicked a lot, but when they're clicked, that's where referral traffic is coming from. And usually they will cite authoritative sources and when the source has the right content, which goes back to what I said earlier. And then lastly, I mentioned very early on that we're in this kind of like messy transition, and it's a lot of green field. That was Google 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago. And so I have the strong conviction that you can establish a first mover advantage here with unclear outcomes, right? Like it's hard to say where things go from here. But again, you don't have to sacrifice the cow to do that. You just need to maybe lead the cow to a couple of more fields than you usually would.
I like it. Kevin talks about cows. I was going to say for this slide, Ramp talk about like time horizons of the investments that they make. So short term, they have like bets that are going to deliver pipeline this quarter. On their third timeline or third horizon, they're looking at ones that will like compound over time. They're going to take many bets. If few of them pay off, it's going to deliver for them. I like the analogy we have here, Kevin, around like ChatGPT looks like Google in the early 2000s. I'm sure there was people in-house on this call who were doing SEO back then that needed to pitch to their CMO, they needed to pitch to like their VP. Maybe walk us through if this analogy is fair, number one, but then you also mentioned at the conferences you're going to, like the need to internally communicate like action on this is like a conversation that's frequently coming up.
Of course. I think like age and tenure is nothing to brag about in SEO because things change. But I remember in my very first job, I was at an agency as a consultant. And I remember that we were working with enterprise companies, and there was so much hesitation and pushback to optimize for search engines that there was one client where we literally flew to their technical engineering team, and we like basically forced a developer, not with violence but not far away either, forced him to implement an H1 tag on pages. It was so much pushback, and it feels a little familiar because we're going through like a kind of a similar thing right now. And what's interesting is you have companies like Ramp paving the way in what the new playbook looks like. And so I think as a message to all the attendees to this webinar, this is really the time to test and make some moves. And I'm probably appealing mostly to the leaders on this call because it often is in the hands of leadership to enable teams to test and learn at a very rapid pace. And sometimes it takes tools, sometimes it just takes permission. But I think that's exactly where we are today. And so the best signal of a company that is, or a team that is set up for this transition phase is how big is your experimentation backlog? What have you tested this week? To do a little bit of an analogy to what have you accomplished this week?
I love it. Maybe we then link that of what you're trying to do to maybe what are the options people can like lay their bets or resources into, and then maybe we'll tie into what's generally working. I think the way we think about it, Kevin, is like you can go and create net new content where you have big directories or even a small blog, you can go and refresh that. And then I think increasingly we're seeing like offsite based on everything you just said with citations and mentions, offsite's coming back. And that's like both getting your content into third-party websites and then engagement on social platforms like your Quora, your Reddit. There's so much that people could spread their resources and time across. But when you work with customers, maybe it's depending on their maturity or where what industry they're in. How can maybe people think about like a framework for where they should start to commit across these four like opportunities?
Yeah, I think a great framework is basically is to take inventory first and ask yourself, okay, where do we land here? I would develop a very simple scorecard or maybe a traffic light system and just take inventory. Is our content really structured? Do we have FAQs? Do we have table of contents, key takeaways? Are we using or leaning into tables, right? Score how many pages have come to a quantification very quickly. Same with content. You can look at the last published or updated date on in your CMS or on your site. Take a strong look at how up to date is your content. Oh, and you guys published this amazing analysis of freshness and importance of freshness in LMs and how important it is that you have very up to date content. Third party content and social conversations. You can prioritize them as well and score yourself. You can go into AirOps and see, okay, where are competitors mentioned and cited on other sites, not in ChatGPT, compared to ourselves. You can quantify it that way. And then lastly, with social conversations, you can do the same thing where you look at how often are Reddit and other forums the citation for a prompt that matters to us. And are we present in these threads or subreddits? And so each of these four different pillars here, I think, can be quantified and scored, and you can assess yourself. And to a large part, you can also assess your competitors and then make a very, I think, easy data-driven decision here on where to start.
I love it. That's an amazing framework. I might steal that myself internally for some of our Q4 planning. But we had some amazing conversations this week, Kevin, at some like roundtables that we ran where people were trying to figure out for the net new content they were going to create, like almost what matters, like what's driving results for other customers, for businesses who are winning today. Like, what are they doing right when it comes to creation? And then, kind of like you mentioned earlier, we do some reports. We took inspiration from one of your growth memos around what succeeded in Google versus ChatGPT. I think we shared similar results, but many questions have come up in the Q&A there around when you think about structure for net new content, what's actually working today? So maybe walk us through some of your own findings and then what we have here too.
Yeah, totally. There is sometimes a misconception that structured data equals schema. So I just want to separate the two at the beginning of this to make this clear. And so in terms of structure, I think there's a lot of like quality of life improvements to content you can make that are also quality of life improvements for LLMs, not just for humans. It's lists, tables, FAQs, table of contents, key takeaways. Those are all elements that I have seen in my own usability studies resonate really well with users because they make it easy to find key pieces of information. But at the same time, they also make it much, much easier for LLMs to associate, parse, and then relate pieces of content to your page, right? So basically, the more structure you bring in, and it can be as simple as headings, right? You have your correct heading alignments, triples the odds of citation. LLMs understand semantic structure. They're pure semantic structure, or pure semantics, better said. And so the easier you make it for LLMs and for users to associate like where to find key piece of information and what that is, the more visible you are. And again, you have that, I think is often forgotten, you have that indirect effect that LLMs heavily lean on search engines, which heavily lean on user behavior. And so to some degree, these optimizations address both users and LMs.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to say, Kevin, that like with everyone coming from like an SEO world into this new world where we'll say a lot of the structural attributes we're able to prove some statistical significance behind it. Is it fair to say that the principles remain the same, but maybe the bar has been raised on just like where you needed to go to a client and get them to implement like a H1, or there's a particular structure they go and need to follow? We're not saying it needs to be like totally programmatic, but the core principles remain true. Just now the bar is higher for competition.
Yeah, I love how you phrase that. The bar absolutely is higher. And to be fair, like creating content has never been easier. But well-structured content is still somewhat hard because it
Mm.
follows certain principles, right? Of topical focus, topical depth, comprehensiveness, etc. Long story short, yes.
Okay, I love it. One thing you brought up as well is around freshness. I know when I ran content at my last team, it was something the SEO guy, Andy Munns, was always clamoring for. He was like, look, we've invested so much in this previous content. We need to get more value out of it. We need to go and refresh it. I did not believe in it. I will like admit to that. And then eventually we got a couple of weeks where we didn't need to do product announcements. We refreshed it, and Andy, I think, doubled our traffic over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. So it proved value, and this is 4 or 5 years ago. I know you've looked at it too, Kevin, when it comes to like content freshness as it relates to citations and getting mentioned and ChatGPT performance. Maybe bring us through like what you found or what you've seen across clients as well.
Yeah. In classic SEO, freshness is still one of these things that works every time. This morning, and this was not prepared, right? Just to be clear, but this morning I spoke to one of my clients who also is an AirOps customer, and one of their proofs of concept was to use AirOps for content refreshes, and you see it like working in an instant. And then, of course, for LLM visibility, it also has significant importance because LLMs have a training data cutoff, right? So they're not trained on live data; they're trained on fixed set corpi of data, and that's why they rely on web retrieval and search. And so for every topic that is basically younger than the training data cutoff, they need to mostly rely on fresh content. But even in other cases, LLMs have many incentives to rely on fresh content. And sometimes they're incredibly fast in finding the newest content. And to your point, Owen, right, this is not new. And a lot of people look at this and say, yeah, we've been doing this for SEO for a long time. And
Mm.
once again, the bar has been raised and you need to keep your content even fresher, right? And so to be fair, right, like I have this three-tiered system of what freshness actually means. It can go from things like outdated data points, outdated facts, to maybe rewriting something in a clear way, to completely rewriting a piece of content from scratch. And so not always do we have to rewrite something. Sometimes it just goes back to making cosmetic changes that make a big difference
Mm.
in the accuracy and authority of the content.
I love it. I think what we see across here are like the return of some good principles and third-party mentions. Again, I'm sure we all get emails from people who can promise us backlinks and a lot more. It does seem like digital PR is coming back, and maybe in a different essence as well, Kevin, where previously maybe backlinks were the way to go, where it was giving like juice and some like topical authority. Now it's just like maybe your brand name needs to appear on these third-party websites. Again, from what you've seen or where you've found success, any like practical tips people can maybe leave today's conversation with?
Totally. I think the king of digital PR is when you bring out research and data stories that are being mentioned and cited by many websites. I think that is truly the best thing that can happen to you because of the scale effects and because of the reputational effects. And it's also the hardest thing to get right. And syndication, I think, is a quick way. Advertorials, affiliate partnerships, these are all quick ways to get the word out more about yourself. But to your point, like I'm seeing a resurgence of sometimes just classic backlink building and guest posting. I think that has limited effect, but some of these paid content distribution channels I think are incredibly powerful. It's worth like looking at your Wikipedia profile again just for maybe 10 minutes and see if there's an opportunity to add another link or maybe just add a bit more richness and depth. But then social platforms, I think, is where the music is playing the loudest, right? So how are you active on Reddit, LinkedIn, YouTube, some niche forums, and where can you place authentic, helpful mentions or sometimes even links of your brand?
Yeah, I think great transition here. Like again, I think this is like the zeitgeist of our time. I don't know how many conversations I've had where people are like, how do I like crack this Reddit engine that everyone seems to be taking advantage of? I don't think anyone per se has cracked it. I definitely know of people who are doing a better job than others, but whether it's cracking it or not, Kevin, maybe what's the play here people should at least start to consider?
Yeah, totally. Look, I think when it comes to forums, great way to test into this as a platform is advertising. So I recommend all my clients to run ad campaigns maybe for 2, 3, 4 weeks with a spicy budget, right? Like really lean into it and see if you get any clicks, engagement, maybe even some conversions. That tells you your audience is there. Second, you want to identify the subreddits and posts that matter most for you. Again, by go to AirOps, looking at your citations or competitor citations and seeing how often Reddit comes up. From there, you want to start engaging on these posts that are most important and most visible to you. Right? No promotion, no kind of trying to influence people. Just mainly the lowest hanging fruit is when somebody asks for recommendations, you jump in. Other opportunities are to fill information gaps, right? If there's a conversation, you can tell from the outside, hey, there's a gap of information, to jump in naturally and say, look, this is what it's really like. It's also great to defend your brand in many cases, unless there's edge cases, right? If you're in insurance, it might be tough. The best thing that can happen to insurances on social platforms is the net zero. But anyway, they're not alone. Like jumping and filling information gaps, defending, like not defending your brand, but like adding context around your brand. So if your brand is in conversation, maybe you can right size some things in a very natural tone. And then over time, you can strengthen engagement more and more, maybe up until starting your own subreddits, but I don't think it's always necessary. I think there's a great world in which you pick 3 to 5 other subreddits, you really establish yourself as a key voice, you drive engagement, and some of that naturally goes back to your profile where you have a link to your site. And then in other cases, it naturally leads to a conversation about your product, which can then mention and talk about in a very authentic engagement.
Makes a ton of sense. I think like some of the key principles you mentioned there that came to mind were around, again, it comes back to figure out where your audience lives. Like you could put in a ton of work, but if your audience isn't in the subreddit, isn't engaged in that conversation, like no matter what you do, there's no real system for you to game there. And then secondly, would definitely back up like you're not there to sell in those platforms. You're there to engage. If you actually, you can go to Google in the background in a different tab if you want, or ChatGPT. But what gets cited are the most useful comments. And I think the brands who are generally doing it right are not the ones saying, hey, use us for X platform. They're the ones who are sharing out, as you said, Kevin, amazing metrics or amazing content that just like, helps the person with the question that made them take time out of their day to start this conversation. So I think despite of many like different tactics you can try, be helpful, share amazing takeaways, and then I think make sure you're doing it where your core audience lives. And then for AEO, brand building, and a lot more, it will raise many ships.
I love the way you phrase that. Going back to Tim Solo, which we talked about earlier, right? He does a Reddit AMA every 2 years, and it resonates incredibly well. Get some hard feedback here and there, don't get me wrong, but it's very authentic. It's like very
Yeah.
genuine. And so I love how you said be useful, be kind, and like engage, right? A lot of people look at Reddit and other forums as a customer acquisition channel, and it's a customer engagement channel and a prospect engagement channel, right? Anyway, don't want to dwell too long on this, but it's worth re-emphasizing.
I love it. Okay, many things you shared today, Kevin, across like ChatGPT. Maybe one thing we didn't fully get into is like the overall search pie growing. That's with like density of the questions and like volume as well. And then just like an opportunity that exists for a marketing, a growth team, a company. Maybe bring us through, or I guess summarize it all for us. And maybe what are the couple of key takeaways the teams here today should start to leave with?
Totally. So yeah, ChatGPT, obviously the next platform here, I think is pretty clear at this point. The big question is in what way, right? Will this become a volume channel or will this become more kind of an influence channel similar to social networks, right? You don't go to Instagram and you expect a lot of referral traffic from a link that you can maybe post to your comments, right? Or link in bio. There's an engagement channel. And engagement is critical. It's everything these days. Even Google is changing from a search engine to an engagement engine or engagement platforms. Again, I think we're transitioning from this world where the playbook was incredibly clear and it was all about execution. How well can you execute that old playbook? We're now in this world, which is a transition where the playbook is still being written and it's going to be written for a while. And I think it's the incumbent's game to lose, right? So whether you work at a startup that is a challenger or an incumbent, you need to rewrite the playbook based on your own experience and based on your own experiments in a wildly changing, rapidly changing environment, right? So that agility is not just something you do for a week. That agility is something that you make part of the culture, right? And there is a chance in my mind to do that faster and better than your competitors and gain a first mover advantage, right? And basically go back to Google in 2005 and be really early, right? With your backlinks and domain and content and whatnot. Again, doesn't mean that Google is obsolete in any way. Google itself is changing in that direction. And I would even argue that by experimenting and gaining experience on ChatGPT today, you might be ready for AI mode tomorrow.
I love it. Always be experimenting, always be ready for change.
Yes.
We will, you've 2 minutes, folks, to get the last set of questions into the Q&A section, and then we'll have about like 10 minutes with Kevin to pick his brain if you haven't already filled up on knowledge for the day. But super quick, just wanted to highlight one or two of our customers. So Chime, amazing customer, but AirOps basically helps them move faster and smarter with AI search. And I picked out some of their metrics, but we spoke about refresh being really important. They as a team are moving 70% quicker on refresh, but that means that they're getting more of their content updated quicker at the brand bar and the quality bar that they care about, and it's driving citations. So when Kevin mentions metrics, and that's one thing I want to ask him for sure more about, like citations, your mention rate, like that's also important in actually proving value from the channel. And then just a reminder, I know people here, I saw many stars for people who are new. AirOps is the only platform that shows you how you stack up in AI search, tells you exactly what to do, and helps you take action at scale with quality and speed. And then as a last reminder for what there's 19 spots for, this is what we have in early access right now. So SEO, I think we went through there. There's so many places you could lay your bets. There's always like a prioritization problem. And with AI search and access to tools, actually, it's made the challenge even harder. So structure, freshness, all of these attributes decide now who appears, you or your competitor. And then that's why we built the AirOps prioritization layer. It combines search intent data, your first party metrics, and then offsite signals like the zeitgeist, Reddit of our time. So final call. We've limited slots remaining. I think Ali gave me a heads up that we have 5 from this cohort that joined. So there's a few left. But if you do join, you'll get a dashboard that shows you exactly where to focus, resources for maximum impact. You'll know where to refresh, what offsite signals matter, and then you're able to prove pipeline impact to the C-suite, which is all of our jobs at some moment in time. Scan the QR code or feel free to email us over at growth@airops.com. All right. And then we have another amazing guest following us next week. So another Chicago man like myself, Andy Crestodina, is going to join us around high-performing content creation that drives conversions. Again, we're talking about like high performance and the ability to like tell authoritative, like convincing stories to your customers and also make it performant in AI search. So definitely tune in for that one. We'll share out the link after this as well. But Kevin, that leads us to Q&A. There are many which I'll probably need a moment to just piece through, so give me that. But here are some questions that came in earlier. We had, I think I put up a social post to over 250 that came in, so it was very tough to piece together which ones to actually go and select from. But I think I saw some common themes emerging. So maybe given some of the Q&A that's come up and what you spoke to as well, we can focus on Evan's one here to begin with around how do we navigate this transitional phase between SEO towards whatever we want to call it, AEO? Like, really, what are the metrics worth tracking?
Totally. Shout out to Evan. Known him for a long time, worked together at G2. And yeah, great to see you. Thanks for the question. Navigation, again, like any transition in any life event right? Whether it's at work or at life, I think experimentation is the key. And in terms of metrics, I like, I have this picture of a house in my head with a strong foundation that is conversions. And then on top of that, you have influence, so share of voice, visibility, those kind of metrics, sentiment as well. And on top of that, you have intent. And intent can be determined by things like crawls from LLMs, specifically RAG crawls or reasoning crawls for the specific user agent to indicate that your content was used for reasoning, but also things like surveys, brand awareness, brand recall, all these kind of things, incredibly helpful these days. And then lastly, things like impressions, right? And I like to qualify impressions by impressions on Google for only keywords that rank in position one as a filter to make sure you're counting impressions from AI overviews. And I think that gives you a really good combination of how big is your reach, how do you compare against customers, and what is the business impact you're driving.
I love it. Makes a ton of sense. Leads us nicely into a question then, Kevin, that Connor had in the chat. Do you think it's yet time to prioritize persona-specific content creation, even when traditional SEO metrics such as volume don't quite justify investment yet?
Yeah, I love it. Thanks, Connor. You're setting me up nicely to pitch my latest growth memo, which is about the personas. So, look, personas is one of these things that I really changed my mind about. In the pre-AI era of search, I was very anti-persona because the search query basically indicates what you want. And that is enough information. You don't need to know who searches for it. Google kind of gives it away with the search results and the query. Now, however, I think personas are absolutely critical because the experience on ChatGPT and Google and everywhere else is getting increasingly personalized, and because people are searching with such rich prompts. And the question is, in my experience, like how many personas do you go after? Do you allow for that granularity that prompts provide, and how do you inform which personas to create? Do you have a channel to your customers, maybe some call transcripts between sales and customer support and all that kind of stuff? Do you mind Reddit? Do you mind Search Console and other data sources for potential prompts? So the better you are at doing this, I think the more relevant the personas are that you can create. But long story short, yes, I think you should absolutely run a persona first approach to AI optimization. And and sometimes that means going after prompts or queries that don't have search volume, but that your persona is actually interested in.
I love it. Very interesting question that came in, Kevin, from Stephen Heath. Is there anything you'd recommend for ChatGPT that could potentially harm rankings on Google?
Totally. Cloaking, mass production of content, and content cannibalization, right? LLMs are much, much better than search engines and classic web retrieval at understanding the fine differences between content. And we're not talking about like you publish the same content in Argentina and in Spain because it's spent. That's not 100% the same, but maybe 70, 80% the same, I think could very much fly on ChatGPT. And I've seen some companies just like pumping out AI generated content, and with the right prompt and the right instrumentation that can actually work. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for classic search on Google.
Got it. Okay, we're down to our last two questions, but we had one other question from Mariella around how do you see traditional earned media coverage or media relations or PR as a function fitting into success on AEO?
Yeah, it depends little bit on how effective it is. If the definition of that is press releases, then probably doesn't fit in very well. But if the definition of that is to publish unique data in the context of a relevant and heated public conversation or topic, then I think it can be extremely effective. And I mentioned syndication earlier. If you have a partner or a team or a person who has incredibly strong ties to news outlets and you can use that for content syndication, I think it can be a big advantage. But I do want to draw the line between classic PR, press releases, PR roadshows, that kind of stuff versus the quote unquote new digital PR.
Makes sense. I think we're still good on time, but one of the last questions that came in from John Triplett was around running into the problem of large scale content refresh. There's so many pages that need to be like scheduled and prioritized. Actually, the prioritization of them is like a problem, he calls out. Do frameworks, how might you think through how to do that prioritization of a massive content library?
Great question. First, I like to build a content refresh dashboard. So you can build this in Google Sheets and Looker and whatever, but I like to use Search Console data as a basis. But you can also use third-party data from Ahrefs and SEMrush and whatnot. But I like to track the traffic and ranking position of every URL over time. You can enrich that with conversions to make sure you prioritize business impact. And then I usually prioritize content that has been declining for a while over time in ranking position. Clicks, again, like tricky metric, you might want to replace it with impressions, but rankings are still indicative of how much Google likes your content. And so if your rank is or average rank per URL is declining over time, that is an indication to me that the content most likely needs to be refreshed. And the other ways, you can also just crawl all of your content and look at the last updated date and keep it within a certain range. I like the dashboard approach a bit more because it's like it has like a better prioritization included. And again, you can also filter all of that by the content that has the highest conversion assists or impact on your conversions in total.
Amazing. Kevin, we could be here for another 3 or 4 hours with all the questions that are collected. So really want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time. For more information, I'm going to assume on your side, we can direct them towards the growth memo, any other place where people can maybe see in real life coming up soon or catch more of the best content that you share.
Yeah, thank you so much. By the way, Owen, great job. This was so much fun. You did really well. Yeah, I'll be again. Where will I be? Conference at the actual Oktoberfest on Sunday night, if you're around. But I'll be at Ahrefs Evolve in San Diego in the middle of October. Right after, I'll be at SEO IRL by Steve Toth in Toronto. I'll be at October, and at the SEOcom, or better said, the Online Expert Days in Salzburg, Austria, and
I think we got the end of it. You'll have a very packed passport, Kevin, after all of that. So hopefully you can stay healthy, safe, and more on all your travels. But thanks so much for joining us today here. If people want to stay up to date at AirOps, our information is there. Feel free to email us at growth@airops.com. But Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. And then for everyone across the world, I think I saw India all the way to Seattle. We had a wide time zone spread. Thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, if there's any other questions or to follow up with us. But thanks again so much, Kevin, and enjoy the rest of your evening and afternoon, folks.